Hey everyone, we've just gone live and we're going to give it 1 or 2 minutes to allow people time to join, settle in, have a coffee, depending on where you are, maybe have some lunch, and we'll be with you in just a moment. Once again, for anybody who's just joined, we're just going to give it another minute to allow any late joiners to come in before we get started. And we're at the top of the second minute, so I think it's about time to get started. So thanks everybody for joining and welcome to our session between WorkFlex and Croissant on working from abroad as a benefit and not a risk. Before we jump into introductions, just a quick little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and all the slides that we'll be presenting today will be shared with you in PDF after. And we do have an active chat function on the side. We prefer that you use the chat rather than the questions function for any questions. We'd really like to keep this as interactive as possible so that we can answer all your burning questions about remote working flexibilities, compliance, and everything in between throughout the session. So without further ado, I will hand over the microphone to my co-conspirator here, Zoltan, for a short introduction, and then we'll take you through our agenda for the day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brock. Pleasure to be here, calling in from New York City. So I have my coffee instead of my lunch, but really excited to be here and to be discussing compliance and working abroad. So just to give a little context, we have teams that use us across the globe, right? So we provide workspace to teams that are working from abroad or going on workations. So we have a ton of data on how people are actually using physical locations, how they're traveling. So I'm really excited to be here because I think this is going to be a really, really fun one.
Yeah, totally. It's super good to have you as well. And I'm Brock, by the way. Despite the accent being similar to yours, I do come from Canada, but I'm coming to you from Barcelona, where 12:30 is even still too early to eat lunch by Spanish standards. So I'll get into that in a little bit. I've been in the travel tech and compliance space for nearly 20 years now, background in airlines and travel. Been working with WorkFlex now for 3, and we take care of all of the data aggregation, tracking, management, and document fulfillment for businesses who send people across borders. So there's lots of interesting things to talk about when it comes to managed workspaces, flexible working, provisions, tracking, and sort of overall employee experience throughout the conversation. And I think it's going to be quite interesting. I'll share a little personal thought in a second, but just want to walk everybody through our agenda first. So I think we're going to start with sort of a definition about flexible working, global mobility, and just some general terms to get us started. Don't worry, we won't be presenting the deck and throwing the book at you throughout the entire session. We do want to keep this a bit more of a fireside chat. So once again, any questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll talk about working from anywhere for companies as a benefit, as an employee offering, and what that looks like. And then depending on the appetite, we can really stick into the legal aspects and compliance risks of actually managing these kinds of programs. And we'll close off with some actual solutions, some benchmarking data on workation policies and how you can help with the risk mitigation across. That sounds like a very angry cat, Zoltan. It's all good. And we'll give everybody some practical feedback on how to manage this as well. But yeah, I mean, before we get started, I think I'm kind of in an interesting space because I'm representing WorkFlex from the international travel side of things, but I'm also a very frequent Croissant user. So very familiar with the setup and structure that you guys offer to the marketplace. As Zoltan and I were chatting about last week, this is my first fully remote company after 17 years of working. So adapting to that lifestyle, Croissant has been an absolute lifesaver when I'm on the road. I live here in Barcelona, but I represent business typically more in Northern European territories, so UKI, Nordics, Benelux. So I'm always bouncing around, and sometimes the kitchen table or the desk at the hotel just doesn't cover it. So there's some interesting personal implications here as well.
Yeah.
Zoltan, how about you? Any thoughts before we dig in?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've, like I mentioned before, we support remote workers and work from anywhere. So we Croissant's been around for about 10 years or so. And basically, teams really come to us once they go distributed, right? So the idea that the office was an operating system kind of went out the window, right? With Slack and Zoom and all the technology available. So when teams comes to us, they're usually like either trying to kick up a new presence in a different country, or they want to bring their employees on because their employees are completely distributed. So that's where we really come in to help. And from a compliance perspective and from WorkFlex, there's some really interesting data because I think there's a lot of pre-assumptions as to how people actually work and take vacations. That what we're seeing in our data is actually kind of very different, right? So like one of the things is that there's actually, like, we call them sort of super nomads, right? The workations, the super nomads is anybody who takes more than a month, then that's in a different region, right? So your HQ may be in, let's say, Northern Europe and France, and you want to go and spend some time on the beach in Portugal, right? So what we're actually seeing is that number is increasing more and more. So more employees want the flexibility, and more employees want to become sort of like these super nomads. So one of the things is like, how do you stay compliant? And there is, I have this funny little anecdote and this story about when in my previous job I was working, and I went to Canada. Actually, we went to Toronto. I'm sorry, it was Montreal. We went to Montreal. I think it's a rival to Toronto, but we went to
No
Montreal.
offense taken.
So we went to Montreal, and I think we were there for about 3 days, and something on my IP or my VPN I think maybe had gotten stuck. But a couple of months later, I'm sitting there in the afternoon on Friday getting ready to log off, and I'm getting ready for the weekend, and I get a Slack from our CPO, or Chief People Officer. She's like, "Why have you been in Canada for the last 4.5 months and not filled out the compliance request form?" And I'm sitting in the Bronx in New York on a Friday afternoon. I'm like, "Well, I'm not in Canada, and I haven't been in Canada, so in the last 3 months." So anyway, she goes on to tell me that that they were like something crazy, like like $20,000 or $30,000 fine that they have been accrued to. And so all that is to say is like this is very important stuff. And employees want more flexibility, and as the world evolves towards more of like, well, what is the new operating system for workforces, this is going to become absolutely like more and more important.
100%. And I hate corporate jargon, but I want to put a pin in that operating system piece and come back around to it in just a second. I also have a funny anecdote. I have a relation that came over who's the inverse, works in Canada, is quite a senior partner at a large Canadian organization, and came to spend some time in Barcelona without realizing that they'd put in a VPN policy. So as soon as they'd realized that he was out of the country, they blocked access to every internal system, including his email and his Teams, meaning that he was completely unable to work until they got everything sorted with an exception. So it's regulatory and compliance stuff is absolutely a significant piece of the pie. But the other side of it is the employee experience part too, because if your hands are completely tied, thinking that you're going to be able to work, like that's can induce some panic as well on the other side. So I really want to talk about the employee experience part, quite significantly today, because I think we both really serve that deeply as organizations. But before we dig into that, maybe we can just set a couple of definitions or sort of high-level ideologies around work from anywhere and global mobility compliance in general. So I always like to start with just a quick shout on, what is global mobility? It's kind of a hot potato that's tossed around between operations and HR and travel teams and risk and finance. And the reality of it is it's quite simple. It's actual physical movement across borders. And there's different reasons for travel. We've talked about several reasons and ways that this can happen, but it's just simple. A border must be crossed, and without crossing a border, compliance obligations don't really apply. There is, of course, caveat emptor to that. If you are in North America, if you're going from state to state or province to province in Canada, there are certain tax regulations that you do have to abide by. But crossing international borders are certainly more onerous. In your case, Zoltan, with the VPN, 3 or 4 months can levy quite a significant penalty for organizations. We could talk about some of those ramifications in a second. And I think it's also worth talking about the division in these two different types. And I think, for our two organizations, the two things that we are really looking at in terms of employee-initiated mobility, which has certainly come to light since COVID kicked everybody back, is what does remote working look like? And remote work, working from another location in general, whether it's permanently or recurring, is kind of the overarching piece here. But it's important to understand what is company-led remote working in terms of flexible working policies or hybrid working policies within your country of origin versus working from abroad, which is actually a benefit program that companies can offer to some of these super nomads down to just somebody who wants to take a long weekend after a conference in Sardinia, for example. If I know of any conferences in Sardinia, please invite me if you do. But workations, work from abroad, work from anywhere policies, different companies have different names. Those are very much employee-led. And I think that's a pretty important distinction. And there's a bunch of additional breakdowns in here, but I think the overarching one here is that temporary working from abroad, workations, what have you, there is no business-related reason for this, other than the employee wants to take their laptop and they want to go do their job, a short-term interruption of business as usual from a different place. As we talked about, country to country, this can have significant ramifications. Other territories, the European Union is actually quite lenient on short terms, border to border, if you're a passport carrying individual. Unfortunately, I only have one Canadian passport, so it's a little more persnickety for me, but that's all good. And just talking briefly on the remote wish as a risk here, just because you want to do something doesn't mean you can do it. And I think you mentioned people just having that expectation that they can just nip over and maybe go to Portugal for a couple of weeks. We've seen lots and lots and lots of examples where personal relationships in companies between a line manager and the subordinate, they just say, yeah, it's just a couple of weeks. It's not really that big of a deal. Just go ahead, and maybe we'll come back around to that when we talk about the actual ramifications and the risk areas that we need to cover here. But I did want to touch back on what you were saying earlier on the bundled operating model piece. So you described the traditional office as a bundled operating model, and with what we've seen after COVID, when a company becomes distributed, what's the first part of the bundle that silently breaks, or what's the thing that nobody notices until something happens?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the biggest, so we call it sort of the silent, the silent, not the silent killer. That's a little harsh, but sort of the silent toll. I'll use the word toll. The silent toll that happens is when you take away that operating model, right? Before, when you had the office, you had all these decisions that were bundled that you just didn't have to make, right? Where's our onboarding happening, right? We want to do onboarding. We want to do customer meetings. We want to do this, everything happened at the office. So as that went away and distributed work became a thing, all these decisions that were made by the office essentially were delegated down to line managers, to employees, and you guys, and I mean, even this is very much a part of that, right? If an employee's like, well, I'm distributed, I work from home 5 days a week. Well, what's really holding me back from going to Sardinia to work 5 days a week, right? My manager probably won't know about it because I'm going to throw up a Zoom background, or even more so, what we're seeing is that companies just don't have a policy for it, right? As they just have these distributed teams, and if somebody wants to go somewhere, they just they give them they're more worried about the spend management aspect of it as more so than the compliance aspect of it, right? So when I say like the operating model fell apart, is that like all those decisions were essentially pushed down to the line managers and the employees. So of course you're going to get more compliance violations, right? Because there isn't that governing structure, and there isn't that centralized place where you have all these decisions that were sort of packaged up. And it's what's like, nope, like it's actually like, this is where we do things and this is where we work,
Totally. And it really echoes what we're seeing in terms of international travel compliance. Obviously, everybody had to scramble to figure out what happened after 2020, 2021. But the slow creep of just sort of, this is normal, this is fine, calling back to the dog with the coffee in the flaming room. You maybe have an HR VP or an office manager or some kind of admin function if you're in the SME space, or maybe you have a global mobility department if you're in the larger enterprise space. But typically these are just 2, 3, even one person. We've been working with some companies, 30,000 people, and the whole thing's run by one individual. And you can get by on a spreadsheet tracker, or you can get by with a couple people until you realize how pervasive these issues are at scale. And for both the physical security of the world that Croissant works in and the legal and compliance cross-border stuff that we're working in, that has some really, really significant downstream impacts. And I'll share again a quick story that we heard. Sometime last year, I was speaking to somebody in HR and operations, or the people experience director, one of those titles. They discovered, similar to you, that somebody had been in a country for going on 4 months, but it's a completely different story because they actually went. So this is an English person who had asked their boss, like I said, just a quick Slack message. Hey, I'm thinking about taking a holiday. I'm going to take my laptop. I'm going to go to Portugal for a week. Is that okay? My partner's doing a conference. Yeah, no problem. Hey, I'm going to extend for another week. Any problems there? Yeah, no problem. Time goes by, nobody checked back in, fully remote hybrid policy. 2 or 3 months in, got another message because he was using Zoom backgrounds and all this. And he said, hey, by the way, Zoltan, I've moved to Portugal. We bought a house and we live here now. And of course, the company's going, what? They don't have a corporate entity in Portugal. This person's now overstayed their Schengen provisions as a UK passport holder. The actual physical hardware security policies, the VPN setup, everybody went, oh my God. It was like people running around with their hair on fire trying to figure out what to do with this. And we've heard everything, from far less severe to even worse. And it's really putting those structures in place to make sure that, A, that we can catch these things before they happen, and B, if something occurs, and how do you actually manage that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the trends that we're seeing growing the fastest, when we look at our data and we look at workspace usage across the globe, and we look at where the company's headquarters are, is sort of like these longer term, I don't know if we want to call them, what was the term? I don't know what terminology it would fall under, whether it's not quite remote work, it's not quite, vacation, but more of like these 30-day
hybrids.
Yeah, kind of like that hybrid where, before it was only about 10% of all the usage that we've seen, and that's actually starting to grow quite significantly. And like back to your point, the problem is that like all of a sudden nobody owns this, and it's like the hot potato, right? It's like, okay, well, who owns it? Is it HR? Is it workplace experience? Is it legal? So there is no owner for it. And a lot of the conversations that we're having, and a lot of companies are coming to us for usage data, because they're saying like, well, we want to know where our employees are working from, to your point, because employees, like everybody's incentive driven. So some people may want to, kind of arbitrage that, I work in UK, so I'm going to go to Portugal, right? It's a little bit more cost effective. But what ends up happening is, like, from talking to a lot of HR folks and legal folks, is that at some point, and I don't have the exact days, but there's this idea of tax residency that kicks in, right? And tax residency is what can really come back, and even personally for employees, that can really come back and bite them in the ass. Bite them in the butt, because you can accrue a lot of fines, even personally and for the company as well.
Oh, this is it. And I think that actually dovetails perfectly into the next couple of slides, where we can actually talk through some of these actual hardcore compliance areas and kind of define what these look like. And I can definitely talk from our perspective, and would love to see how they shake up in your world as well. we've already talked about the differences between remote working policies, employee-led setups, but there's also that piece of business travel. And I think to your point, just now talking about some of these super users versus these casual users, like I said before, I've been in the travel management space for going on 20 years, and there's been a significant shift in just employee behavior. The actual number of business trips, the number of flights being taken haven't changed. In fact, they've actually gone up since 2019. But the actual travel patterns and the reasons for going and the length of trip, as you've said, have significantly shifted. Instead of just doing a couple of weekends here and then doing a conference there, or flying into London for a day meeting, people are really shifting the employee expectations of what's permissible. And it's exactly like you said, I do this job from home, so why can't I do this job from Sardinia? So somebody might go to in my case, I go from Barcelona to London for a conference on a Wednesday, Thursday, but I might go in on a Monday to do a couple client meetings on a Tuesday. And I'll stick around for the weekend to see some friends. But it's really important to understand the differential between business travel and this temporary working from abroad or workation stuff, because the responsibility lines or the ramifications can shake it quite a bit differently. Mm-hmm. And if people want to hear a real horror story, I can share one in a second. But I think it's just important to remind everybody that a business trip is 100% driven with a pure business interest, paid for and initiated by the company. And the costs, the hotel, the flight, the taxis, whatever, are conveyed by the employer. And whatever your meal expense policy looks like is definitely, your mileage may vary. But that means that when somebody's traveling for business, there are other things to consider. If you have a corporate travel policy or a corporate health insurance policy, that does apply there. But if we move that over to the working from abroad or temporary flexible working setup, you have to make sure you've got some kind of guardrails in place, because the things that cover you for business travel start to fall apart when you have it shift into something that's more employee led.
Yeah. And I think there's a little bit of an assumption, I think, that a lot of companies have, and I just wanted to share this anecdote, is that this is very, a lot of companies think that like, oh, this is seasonal, right? Like, oh, this is going to happen in maybe August and July when people, in the summertime. And what the usage data actually tells us is that's absolutely not true. What's actually happening is that it's pretty even keel year around. Like there may be a little bump in the summer, but from a data perspective and from what we see in the usage is that like it's pretty averaged out over the course of the entire year, right? So what I'm trying to say is that this is not just like a seasonal problem or a seasonal thing. Like this is something that is ongoing, like along the entire year.
Yeah. And, especially when you start throwing in these hybrid organizations with some of these super users, I know that even some of my colleagues at WorkFlex, we have some people who fully embrace van life and they bounce around Europe with no fixed address. We actually have some colleagues who have recently become parents, and that has forced them to shift their priorities a little bit. But, I know some people who haven't had fixed addresses for, upwards of half a decade. And, you do really have to manage both corporate and personal ramifications there as well. Not a sponsored comment here, but I've got a couple of pals that have houses in multiple places, and so tracking personal tax ramifications is super important. You talked about the tax regulations. Typically, it's 183 days in another host country, but understanding how you can remain tax resident in your home country versus when you might convert into tax resident of another territory is super important. On an individual level, that can mean double filings for yourself. That could mean Social Security contributions. But for a company as well, as you said, if you got tracked for 4 months in Canada, there could be huge, significant fines. And maybe we can talk about some of these in just a second. I'll get back to the anecdote in a second. We'll dig into that in a minute. But talk briefly about the main compliance risks that we see, and would love to understand how some of these fit into the more physical space side of your world in terms of office space and employee experience as well. And again, we won't go into this in super detail, everybody, but just to call these things to attention, it's not just, can I get in with my passport? It's, can I get in? Can I actually work? And there's actually, thinking of Canada, my home and native land, they've actually just introduced legislation that is kind of sticking towards the super nomads or the the influencer marketing types, where if somebody is going in on a tourist visa, they do not have the right to work for a Canadian client under those provisions. And if the Canadian government finds out that you are working for a Canadian customer, there could be significant ramifications. And this only was enacted a couple of months ago. So, you've got somebody who's been living in Bali, they're a German influencer, all of a sudden they come into Canada because they're allowed to be there for 90 days in any 180-day rolling. And they're now selling an ad spot for Shopify, who's based in Toronto. That could be a massive smack on the wrist for them because they don't actually have a proper work visa or a work permit to be carrying out business in Canada. And we've also actually, Indonesia was in mind with Bali because they've also done the same. A location that is super, super hot with major nomad visitors, a lot of marketing folk, friends in my circle, can fall afoul of these things too. And so it's not just the visa, it's not just the passport, but it's the length of stay, which can impact your personal and employer tax. People don't realize that if you spend enough time and are shown to be doing work of value in a host country, that could also mean permanent establishment risks. Even if you don't have an office, it could mean that the company does have to register in Europe, pay VAT, and go through all of the rigmarole of setting up an entity if you've got enough physical presence. Social Security, posted workers, there's lots of things in here as well. But again, can't talk enough about the duty of care piece, the actual traveler tracking, the understanding of where they are and what they're doing, not just for safety, but also for comfort and productivity of the employee. We're seeing a lot of stuff over here right now with the wildfires. We're seeing a lot of stuff geopolitically as well. And knowing where your people are couldn't be more important these days. So yeah, Zoltan, could you maybe talk a little bit about how that's been shaking out and some data patterns from Croissant?
Yeah, one of the use cases that we also serve is when companies say, hey, we want to open up, we want to attack a market and put our go-to-market team on the ground, right? And they'll say, so for example, I'll use Northern Europe, right? Like Finland, Sweden. We recently, this is a real use case. We recently had a company that said, hey, we have a go-to-market team. We want to put them on the ground to test out the market. There is actually compliance and regulation that comes with that as well, right? In certain Northern European countries, you have to provide a certain type of environment for your employees, right? And you have to have budget allocated to that, whether that's a certain amount of square meters or whether that's a certain type of environment and healthy enough for the employee, right? So in a lot of countries, it's not just as simple as like, hey, like we're gonna send people to kind of settle into the ground and they can figure it out on their own, see you later, report back with the revenue numbers, so to speak, right? It also has to be about providing them with the right setup and providing them with the right type of work environment, and I think like, especially when you start to think about like Finland, Sweden, like they have these type of rules, and that could very well just be working from home, but essentially providing a budget and a stipend to be able to, set that home environment up in a way where that meets certain requirements, that complies with the laws of that country, right? So there's a lot more that goes into it. There's a lot more that goes into it than just like, hey, we're going to test out a market to see if go-to-market works here and to see if we get traction. So we're just going to drop a bunch of people here. They'll work out of coffee shops and, we'll see you later. It's actually a lot more. It's a lot more involved than that than in certain countries.
So, maybe let's talk horror stories for a second. And thank you very much, Alicia, for the question. We'll get to that in just a second. I can imagine you've seen everything from shining star examples to what are you even talking about? What's one of the more, shall we say, outlandish or well-intentioned but highly ineffective way that you've seen companies start with something like a go-to-market setup for workspace management for distributed teams and things?
Yeah, I think, just generally speaking, I think, going back to our point, this operating model of, like distributed work compliance and distributed, like there isn't a single owner. So it's a little bit of, like I said, a hot potato, right? Of like, well, I don't own this. So it gets kind of thrown around. And so what ends up happening is as any human, you look for the easiest way out, right? You're like, okay, well, what's the easy button for this? So what a lot of companies end up doing is they'll just say, you know what? We'll do a stipend. We'll give them a credit card. We'll give them a reimbursement, and we'll just put a cap on that credit card. And yeah, that works on the spend side, right? So yes, that absolutely works to make sure that you stay in budget. And you stay in budget for the spend, but there is this whole other area over here that's not being covered, and compliance being one of them, right? That is probably the most frequent and typical thing that we see. But as companies grow, especially and then the reimbursements are a fun one, because I think, and this is a true story. We worked with this company, and the chief of staff came to us, and she said to us, yeah, we've decided to put a program in place because the last reimbursement was actually a sailboat, because they said that was a so we decided that our reimbursements weren't working anymore. And aside from the 15, 20 hours it takes to reimburse everybody, get the receipts, hound employees, she just said, well, it's not really working for us anymore. Sailboat might not quite be a workspace,
Oh, wow.
So those are kind of the two big ones, right? Is what is the easy button? But as companies get bigger, there's certain thresholds where these operational things kind of break. You have 100 employees, it looks very different than at 20, right? Stipends and reimbursements may work at 20. They're not going to work at 100. And then once you're at 100, what works at 100 is not going to work at 1,000,
I mean, it's that classic startup adage, right? What got you here ain't going to get you there. And, one of the stories that I'm sure I've told on previous webinars before, it's honest to goodness quite a bit of a horror story, but it's just one of those things that came of I think this is fine, and it just kind of leaving it to grow and metastasize in its own way. And again, it's a European example where an individual, not the guy that bought the house, but somebody else said, hey, boss, I'm just going to go and do a trip. I forget which country, but let's say Portugal again. And it was a short one, 2-3 weeks, whatever it was. Is there anything I need to do? Boss figured that corporate insurance is going to cover everything. Nah, just take your laptop. You're all good. Individual was not working from a managed space, not working from a sailboat, thankfully, but was working at a cafe, or I'm not sure the specifics exactly, but tripped on her laptop cable and cracked her head on a table and was taken to the hospital where she was pronounced paraplegic, and ended up spending 6 months in the hospital through therapy, rehabilitation, and all the rest of this. Had to be airlifted home. And then she tried to sue the company because the insurance wouldn't, the company insurance wasn't covering it. She was being asked to pay out of pocket. And she said, well, no, I was working. And they said, well, no, you were on a workation. Of course, the jurisdictional authority said, you have shown, 6 months of sitting here in the hospital on VPN access. You've been taking your company laptop to and from. You were working. This is a company duty of care lapse, and this is on them. So they got smacked with a tens of thousands of euros fine, had to pay for the repatriation and the hospital bill, and it cost her manager her job for not doing her diligence. And, that is, I think, possibly the worst far end of the spectrum story that I could hear of. But, if I had a nickel for every other small story where you hear about a smack on the wrist, or issues at entry because of taxation regulations or permanent establishment fines, I would be a rich man. but here we are. Briefly, I want to, I don't know what Shree's typing there, but I really like Alicia's question on PE risk, because it is something that's quite misunderstood by an employee. And it kind of depends on the country pairs and the type of work that you're doing and the length of time that you're spending there. I don't know, Zoltan, do you have any experience in permanent establishment risks in some of the corporate customers that you're working with?
Sorry, I'm just reading the question. Understand meet our compliance frequently. Understand how we. It's permanent establishment risk on our end. I mean, from a physical office perspective, if you're working with a flexible operator, those contracts, so speaking just from the physical office location, those contracts are pretty flexible. Some of them do require that you do have some sort of an entity established in the country, right? So as you start to go abroad, especially as you start going more and more into Asia, a lot of these providers may not necessarily be able to work with you if you don't have some sort of an entity set up within that region, right? So that's generally something that we also help our clients with as well.
For sure. We actually have a slide in here that I can dig into. Risk mitigation, permanent establishment. I think it's this one. No, that's documentation. It's in here somewhere. Anyway, I'll get back to that in a second. But the side that we see from that kind of ties in, but there's also the actual value of the work or the type of work that's being done. So there's the physical entity side of things, and there's the registrations from a governmental perspective. But there's kind of a two-banger on this. If you've got one individual who is a senior executive or is a salesperson or has power of attorney for the company, and they are negotiating contracts, finalizing sales, doing big, heavy, valuable work in the country, then that can actually trigger a permanent establishment risk just from having that one individual there. But the other one is that there's a cumulative risk as well, and this is something that we see a little bit more in Europe because you've got destination hotspots for countries. A lot of people from the north like to come down to Spain, Italy, France, Portugal. And there can also be a collective permanent establishment risk if you have multiple people from the same sort of function or same entity coming into a country to do the same amount of work. So similar to how much you got to track how much time you, the individual, are in a country to avoid passport lapses or taxation, you also have to know institutionally how many people you have doing what in a country to be able to manage that risk. Because if the employee does get called up, and we'll be honest, the likelihood of being called up on a PE risk for something minor is quite small. But if you do, it can be tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, euros, pounds, whatever in fees. But it's also the ramifications of having to actually create a permanent establishment in that country. And then you have other taxation and corporate planning to worry about, registrations, and it just becomes an admin nightmare across the organization. Just because it was one individual being like, don't worry about me, I won't get caught.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, when we're managing policies, we do like to remind employees, if you're going on a workation, please don't be highly visible and sign a bunch of contracts and post all over LinkedIn that you just won the biggest deal of your life while you were sitting with your toes in the sand in Faro. But yeah, it is something that requires some understanding and some nuance there. So that's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of that, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, even if you don't have permanence established there, I mean, in a sense, it's like if you think about a business, it is an entity, right? It is a person. So the business, to some degree, if you have a representative in another country, that they are required to follow those regulations and those laws, right? So that essentially does expose you to that compliance risk, right? So it's like, yeah, we don't want to talk about it. We'll be heads down, but it's not so much about getting caught as it is probably about just following the compliance and the regulations of that country, because you are technically, if you have somebody in that country, there is representation from your company within that country.
100%. And I just see that we have another question here from Shri. And maybe I'll tackle it from the benefit permissions point, and then would love to hear. So you've talked about moving from the just the pure spend and leave it to the employee side of things, and would also love to understand what are some of the best practices in terms of setting up a bit more of a formal policy in terms of an actual program. So the question is, we've got requests for work from abroad, but some of the risks are new and it's making you hesitant. And this is something that we deal with on a, sometimes I feel like hourly basis. If you're two people sitting in office, maybe you don't want to, but as soon as you start having 5, 10, 15 people asking about this on an annual basis, getting your ducks in a row could not be more important. The good news is getting a base policy in place, just understanding what countries do you allow and what kind of time limit do you allow people to take in a year is even a great baseline. Mm-hmm. If you want to take that to the next level and start getting, a partner like WorkFlex potentially, or hiring an FTE, or, putting the onus on somebody in your admin team, there are lots of things that you can do there. But the thing with managing these risks properly are that they're quite nuanced, because every person is different. Everybody's got a different passport. Everybody works in a different job. If you're a larger company, you might have different regions, different offices, different entities. And every time a different person crosses a different border, there are different things that you have to manage. Without turning this into a big sales call, song and dance, companies like WorkFlex help you by aggregating all of those disparate data points on demographics and travel information and give you that structured rubric for both your policy and the actual request, and help you understand what the risk tolerance looks like and how to manage all of those documents to help you avoid it. And from our perspective, to get a decent policy in place, it shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks of understanding what the operational setup looks like, and understanding what your risk appetite looks like too. We're really in the compliance game as a company like WorkFlex, and really want to see a zero tolerance policy. So we're doing full mitigation and full actual measurements across the board. But again, there's no such thing as a one size fits all for companies. So we like to be flexible in how we can help manage that. So how about on the Croissant side? Like, how do you approach building policies and setups?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to Shree's point, I would sort of I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater yet, so to speak, because we did a Glassdoor research, right, where we pulled I think it was about 5,000 or 6,000 5-star reviews, and these 5-star reviews are people that love working for the company, and about 38 or 39% of them mentioned some sort of isolations, more wanting for flexibility, more wanting to work in different locations, whether that's abroad. So what I'm saying is, working from abroad is not it's a great thing. Like, that's what this new distributed world is allowing us to do. It allows companies to hire in a distributed way, to go where the talent is at a more cost-effective way. And on the flip side, it allows employees to be more flexible, right? So what I mean by that is really like flexibility. Like, candidates, if one of your objectives is to capture and retain the best talent, flexibility is an absolute benefit, right? Like, it is something that you almost kind of have to have in today's world. So thinking more about what does that policy look like, and this is why companies like, this is sort of a PSA, but this is why companies like WorkFlex and Croissant exist, is because, yes, it is an absolute admin nightmare. Yes, it is an absolute admin nightmare that if, you have 5 employees and they want to go to 15 different countries, now you have to be aware of 15 different, compliance regulations. And then from a physical location perspective, you have to juggle 15 different vendors. So all of this becomes very, I think the biggest risk is probably the admin overhead, right? Like, you don't want your job to become managing compliance across, wherever your employees want to go, nor do you want to manage like physical workspace vendor relationships and things like that. So that's why we exist, is like, we make it really easy for you to do that, so you can transfer that benefit down to your employees, so that when you are talking to candidates, right, and you want this candidate, and it doesn't just come down to salary and everything, but sometimes just saying like, yeah, you know what, you can go work from Spain for 3 months, and we're okay with that. Sometimes that's the deciding factor. I had in my previous job, I had an employee. She was one of the brightest data scientists I've ever met, and she could have gone out at any moment, gotten a job with higher pay, gotten a job with better benefits. But the reason she continued to stay with us is we let her travel and live in a new country every 3 months, right? So it is a very real thing, and it is a benefit. So instead of looking at it as more of like an isolation of like, should we do it or should we not do it? The risks are too high. How do you mitigate that risk? And like, WorkFlex and Croissant can absolutely help you with that.
100%. The thought of moving every 3 months is, on one side, so glamorous, but on the other side, terrifying. I like my guitars and my record collection too much to be logging that around to airports. But no, I think you're right. And I think like the term I like to use in that world is employer brand. It's the ability for your employees to feel, and this is a line I learned from an HR leader many, many years ago. Another thing is, a happier employee is a more productive employee. And if you give them that agency and that trust that they will do good and that they will do well by the company, then everybody just feels so much better. And we have spoken to so many organizations where they're seeing people vote in that realm with their feet. And being able to put these policies in is really worth the a little bit of admin lift that you need to do, whether you're doing it internally or taking on suppliers like us to really manage that. I did see a question on A1s here. So it's a very quick question, Claire. Thank you. Yeah, the long story short is yes, you are at risk if you're not filing A1s, and somebody can be proven to be working from another country. The likelihood and liability is a question that we could take offline, but yes, again, from a total compliance perspective, if the individual can be proven to be working, Social Security can come up and bite them in the bum, as you said earlier. It theoretically could be. Alicia, I'm thinking you're talking about the A1. It could be, but in typical setups, I think she's clarifying this, in typical setups under the duty of care side of things, A1, it can be done. And it's one of those, your mileage may vary areas that we see all the time. On one side, we have a wonderful globally underwritten travel insurance policy for people who use us for workations. And it's just something that we want to offer, to avoid the hitting your head on a desk situation. Other companies say, we'd much rather put that on an employee to manage and make sure that they have their travel insurance covered so that if something happens, they're taken care of. Some companies may say, we would love for you to take the A1s off our shoulders because it's something that we do with ease. But if it's something that you want to push to the employee, yeah, you absolutely can. But again, understand that you have to have a process and policy in place where they can prove that they've done that, because if they got called up on it, it's not their responsibility for getting it. It's actually the company who will be seen as at fault because they were allowing the employee to work without the proper documentation. We'd love to see any more questions that pop up. I think we can kind of do 5 more minutes, 10 more if some more questions come in. But would love to know some sort of best practices in terms of helping companies create these policies. From maybe you could start, Zoltan. How can people get their foot in the door? How can you maybe help rationalize what it looks like to set up some sort of a program or policy in your world here, so that it doesn't seem like a big scary mountain to climb?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the first step that we always talk to our customers with, and we take a very sort of consultative approach, is, what does your team look like? Where are they? And what are their functions, right? Because in a distributed environment where most of the work is done remotely, you really only need physical locations for business outcomes, right? And what do I mean by that? It means that usually the biggest use cases we have is for like R&D teams doing planning, right? Employee onboarding, that's a huge one. That's a big question we get, is that everybody's working for remotely, but we have a cluster in Porto. So how can we do employee onboarding? So step 1 is really audit where your employees are. Step 2 is audit where there are clusters. And then step 3 is kind of like a bottoms up approach of figure out what those outcomes that you're looking for are. And that's going to transfer into what kind of access you're going to allow your employees on our platform, and what kind of spend you want to allocate to that, right? So it sort of all starts at the very bottom of understanding, in a very simple layman's term, the framework is where are your people, what departments are they in, and what are the business outcomes they achieve. Once you have those 3 pillars, then it's very easy to translate that into spend based on the usage data that we have. We have over 4 million hours of usage data, and then transferring that into a policy. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I think it really echoes, what we're doing in terms of that bottom-up understanding, because again, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. We work with companies that are 50-person startups that are fully distributed and work across 20 countries. We also work with large multinationals who are in retail or manufacturing. And, there's a lot more we can talk about, or I could talk about on our side from, business travel and the rest of this, but from an actual employee-led business or workation policy, some companies just can't offer that benefit to a large swath of their people. And understanding, what is your setup? What do your people do? What flexibilities do they need on the day-to-day? And then understand the company's risk appetite on the back of that. We can help put together, these policies, these workflows, these risk mitigation factors to really be kind of your right arm to avoid, every 5 minutes somebody else asking a question in Teams or Slack, being like, "Hey, can I go to Portugal?"
Yeah. And on your end, what is the sort of the number one what is sort of like the number one compliance or the number one question you wished every HR person would ask? You know, like maybe before starting to work with WorkFlex or just in general, like what is that number one sort of compliance related question that you wish like HR folks asked?
Do you know where your people are? Think back to the 1980s PSA. It's 8 p.m. Do you know where your children are? Because you'd be surprised how many organizations, by no fault necessarily, have let some kind of provisions, permissions, or allotment just grow organically.
Mhm.
Oh, hey, so-and-so went to France for a couple of weeks last year. Oh, yeah, I'll just talk to my boss. Yeah, no worries. All of a sudden, if you've got somebody who smacks their head, or if you've got somebody who's currently in Madrid where there's a raging forest fire and you don't know that they are there, from an employer duty of care perspective, you have no recourse or way to actually manage that employee's experience. And that's the most terrifying thing, I think, to organizations. Organizational safety and employee experience are so crucial because they are your capital. They're your humans. They're your people. And then there's a million and one other things that I'd love for them to ask as support questions. But if you know where they are and you know that you have a workflow in place to allow them to be happy and flexible, that's kind of question 1.5, then you are already on your way to having a more successful time of managing this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And how about you? What's the one question you wish that people were asking on the ground?
Yeah, so for us, it would essentially be kind of very similar to yours is, where are your people and are you giving them the place to get their business outcomes, right? That's what it comes down to us. It's physical location and providing that physical location to achieve their business outcomes, whether that's 1 day a week in an office with employees or whether that's, once a month. So for us, it is very much the same about, where your people are, and then how do we get that coverage for physical locations to get what they need. Yeah.
I think that dovetails extraordinarily nicely on both sides.
Yeah.
I mean, I realize that we're coming up to minute 52 here, so we've been yakking everybody's ears off. So maybe I don't know, Zoltan, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to leave the fine folk with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this was great, and as always, if anybody has any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to the team about physical locations, or if you are relocating your team anywhere, or if you anything around distributed, if you're looking to expand your team, if you're looking to hire in a different country because you're expanding your footprint, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help in any way that we can.
No, it's fantastic. And it's the same for us. If you're looking at launching a work from abroad benefit, if you already have people traveling around and you need to know how to manage that in a better way, or you want to talk about travel compliance and the bigger and scarier side of things with business travel, assignments, immigration, and all the rest of that, we'd be happy to have a chat. We will be sharing the deck afterwards as well with all of our contact details and a lot more bonus material at the end about actual the risk areas, the information behind those, and mitigation areas too. And really thank you all for the interactive questions. Thanks for being here, and wishing you a wonderful end of your July. Thanks so much, Zoltan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Brock. Pleasure.
Take care.
You too.